In 2002, Martin Scorsese released his historical epic Gangs of New York, which was positively received by critics, but the subsequent 2 decades have left the film with a strange legacy. In and amongst Scorsese's filmography, the movie seems largely forgotten, though that might have more to do with other movies the director has made being so impressive. But it can't be denied that there are strong criticisms that have stuck with the film, like Cameron Diaz's performance and Leonardo DiCaprio's wandering accent and messy storytelling. And this has been combined with a unanimous praise of elements of the film, such as Daniel Day-Lewis's ferocious performance as Bill the Butcher, or the fantastic sets, costumes and production design. It had staggering ambitious scale and unflinching gritty violence. But those who criticised the film said it lacked focus, was messy and had questionable artistic choices. Thus, we're left with a film that it's probably fair to conclude is uneven and doesn't quite match up to the sum of its parts. Let me know what you think of the film down in the comments section below, and while you're there, subscribe to the channel. We follow Leonardo DiCaprio's Amsterdam, the first of Leo and Marty's many collaborations over the years, in which the young Amsterdam's father, Priest Valen, is killed in a gang battle between the priest's dead rabbit, mainly made up of Irish Catholic immigrants, and William Cutting, aka Bill the Butcher's natives. The dead rabbits are outlawed, the natives take control of New York's 5 Points, and 16 years later Amsterdam returns to take revenge on the man who murdered his father. In doing so, however, he gets taken under the wing of the Butcher, who takes a shine to him, leaving Amsterdam conflicted in his mission. Perhaps the divided reputation of Gangs of New York can be summarized by taking a look at the opening battle sequence. The march to the battlefield with the tribal music pumping and the characters all preparing their weapons gets you pumped, and the battle itself is a pure bloodbath, gloriously brutal, a symphony of violence and a collation of horrific scenes. It's utterly wild, and puts fights of a similar ilk, even in later films like The Dark Knight Rises, to shame. It feels like the endgame of violence for the new wave Hollywood generation of the 1970s, in that it's made in the style of those films, no CGI, only old school effects, just on a scale, budget and freedom that was not available to those filmmakers at that time. Scorsese, for example, being forced to tone down the colour of the blood in Taxi Driver. The apex of violence in Scorsese's filmography was reached with this film, this scene in particular, and after this, his films became far less concerned with visceral brutality. But the battle is also completely bizarre. It doesn't always work, like the long take of Bill mowing down his enemies with no blood coming out of them. Ironically, seeing as though later Scorsese films have become heavily reliant on CGI, I think this shot would have benefited from some CGI blood spraying out of a few of the victims, because as it stands, it almost feels like a dress rehearsal, a shot where they forgot to add the special effects. I'm torn on the opening fight. Would I be more critical, I wonder, if I saw this in a film made by a lesser director, and is my respect for Scorsese keeping disapproval at bay? There's strange editing choices, the frame rate changing dramatically, continuity errors, a woman who looks like she walked off the set of a vampire film, flying through the air, scratching people left, right and centre and biting their ears off. Although to be fair, apparently this woman did really exist. Liam Neeson gets hit in the arm with an axe or something, but the next shot shows him using his arms just fine. This was from an alternate death scene, by the way, where Valen is mutilated, having both arms chopped off, but they still kept that bit in the film. And the most egregious thing that completely took me out of the fight was the modern sounding music, electric guitars and all. I remember thinking the first time I watched it, what the hell? This is so unlike Scorsese, using music that's not from the time period. The only way I could really reconcile it is if it was supposed to be looking at this fight from a kind of time capsule perspective, a tragic relic from the past, hence the music evoking melancholy and also being modern sounding. It would make sense, I guess. Part of the entire reason Scorsese made the film was that he discovered his beloved New York had so much history he wasn't aware of, and there were entire generations of people and stories that have faded away, as emphasized by the film's final shot. There's also the element where Scorsese wants to push the idea that New York was born in the streets, and that's also something we see in the film, that these relics from the old world are either killed off, like the butcher and the priest, or they adapt into the new civilized world, like John C. Reilly's character who becomes a cop, or monk who becomes a politician. The execution of the themes might not be smooth and flawless, but the elements are there. Gangs was a passion project for Scorsese, up to the level of Last Temptation and Silence. That phrase, passion project, gets thrown around a lot, but it really was a film he'd been wanting to make since the 70s, with a cast that would have included Robert De Niro and Meryl Streep. I was a kid when the film came out, and I can't quite imagine how high the hype must have been for a film called Gangs of New York to be released by the director of Goodfellas and Casino after a 3-year production with this cast and with a mammoth budget. Of course, it's not fair to discuss the choppy nature of Gangs without talking about what went on behind the scenes. The film's producer was the infamous Harvey Weinstein, who had a rep well before he went down, not just for the horrible casting couch stuff, but also a dictator who would take complete control of film productions, even editing and cutting films the way he wanted them. Harvey Scissorhands, they apparently used to call him. And what many don't remember is that the clashing visions of Scorsese and Weinstein became a story in of itself during the filming of the movie, so much so that top Hollywood PR individuals were hired to downplay any rumours of production problems and ensure everything came off as hunky-dory to the public. And with Weinstein behind bars and Scorsese not really being one to badmouth others in the industry, we'll likely never know the true extent of what went on behind the scenes, but it definitely had an impact on the final product, and one could argue it's Scorsese's most compromised film. There's a lot that can be said, but to summarise, it was Scorsese's first project with Weinstein, once one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, and at the height of his power during the filming of Gangs. Through Miramax, Weinstein's company, the man jumped at the chance to work with Scorsese, but the two industry titans didn't see eye to eye on anything, and they pretty much went to war on the shoot. For starters, Scorsese wanted to put his vision on celluloid, whilst Weinstein wanted to put bodies in seats, the classic director versus studio battle. This was the main catalyst for their constant disagreements, which both have admitted did take place. The two envisioned very different films. Scorsese wanted to explore the riots and gang culture of the time, explore the forgotten history, while Weinstein wanted to focus on the love triangle between the three leads and insisted on the casting of the bankable Cameron Diaz, where Scorsese had wanted the more unknown Sarah Polley. And of course, perhaps the most universally criticised element of the film is Diaz's performance. Scorsese described Weinstein as imposing, noting that the producer denied him requests so often that it felt deliberate. For example, Scorsese asked to build a full-scale church, which Weinstein refused, but Scorsese went ahead and did it anyway. Daniel Day-Lewis recalled one complaint from Weinstein, that his character, Bill the Butcher, had too much oil in his hair. It's easy to side with one of the all-time great American filmmakers against a producer famously intrusive and now disgraced, but it's important to remember how expensive the film was and that it went over schedule and over budget, so much so that both Scorsese and DiCaprio gave back some of their salary to aid production. Writer Jay Cox recalled the final week of shooting, saying the pressure on Marty was intense. Scorsese was filming the final confrontation between Daniel Day-Lewis and DiCaprio, but the studio made him stop before he got all the shots. He later had to perform extended shoots after editing began to fill in the missing pieces. This offers us just one glimpse of how frustrating the shoot must have been. The final film is rumoured to be very different from what Scorsese originally envisioned. In fact, there's an entire unused Elmer Bernstein score out there for the film that was never used, having been replaced by the Howard Shore one we hear in the film. Scorsese has always maintained that the final cut is his film, and that he is happy with it. Whether this is his known distaste for director's cuts manifesting once again, his reluctance to go against powerful studios, or simply the honest truth is up for debate. What's certain is that an alternate cut does exist, a 3.5-hour version with Bernstein's original score, and one that was more expansive than the final version. Scorsese presented this version as his final cut, but Weinstein balked at the runtime and cut it to 2 hours and 36 minutes. There's no conclusive proof that Scorsese was locked out of the editing room, but it is interesting that a longer version of the film exists, one Scorsese was, at least at one point, content with. Reportedly, He passed along the workprint version of Gangs on VHS tapes and confided, "Putting aside my contractual obligation to deliver a shorter 2-hour and 40-minute version to Miramax, this is the version I'm happiest with," or words to that effect. Writer Jeff Ross saw a workprint version that was longer than the theatrical cut. He described it as having no voice-over narration, being more cinematic, and ultimately superior to the final release, which he called compressed, simplified, lathered in big movie music, and thematically obscured. That sounds like the description of a film tampered with by Weinstein's notorious interference. Director and producer David Poland also saw this version, saying it was the movie Scorsese had wanted to make for years. When Weinstein was asked about this alternate cut, he claimed Scorsese told him, "You think I'm that stupid that I'm gonna put out the director's cut at 3 hours and 36 minutes? That would prove Harvey's a genius." I don't really know what he means by that, but it sounds like typical Weinstein boasting. I must say, I feel an unscratched itch knowing that a longer cut exists, one that will apparently never be seen, despite apparently being superior. It's sad that Scorsese has put so much effort into restoring other filmmakers' works, including his restoration work on Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America, which I talked about in detail in another video, and yet for his own film, he doesn't push for an alternative cut to be released to the public. I'll always wonder, how much of Gangs is Scorsese and how much of it is Weinstein? I mean, I can't imagine, for example, Scorsese wanting that U2 song at the end of the film. You wonder about a lot of stuff in the film. Are the noticeable bizarre editing effects because it was early 2000s and a lot of filmmakers were experimenting? Or was the movie chopped up by Scissorhands? Bill the Butcher and Boss Tweed talking edgy politics comes to mind, and it all of a sudden fades to something else, and then fades back to the end of their conversation. Is this an example of something that was cut out of the 3.5-hour version? It's probably dishonest to handwave the faults of the film and everything off-putting as a result of it being taken away from Scorsese, but you can't help feel so much of it doesn't feel very Scorsese, like the editing and the music. This is speculation, but I also feel Gangs of New York took something out of Scorsese. He described directing it in a style he called kamikaze, meaning he poured all his sweat and blood into it. The only other film he has spoken about in this way was Raging Bull, while he directed after literally being on his deathbed, thinking it might be his last and very much planning it as his final movie. Likewise, Scorsese did consider retiring from filmmaking after the experience of working on Gangs. After Gangs, similar to what happened to Scorsese after Raging Bull, Scorsese's films began to feel more commercial and less personal. I talked about this more in my video going through Scorsese's entire filmography, but I always felt he no longer seemed to push boundaries and was content with making commercial fare like The Departed and Shutter Island, the latter which he's actually expressed regret at making. Perhaps this was the case of a veteran filmmaker burnt out by a bogey project, with him since having returned to personal projects like Silence and The Irishman. Going back to Gangs, I have to say, for all its flaws, I love the film. It's definitely not perfect, but I had such a great time being in that dirty, seedy underbelly of New York. Whilst other filmmakers would, and did, make movies on the Civil War, on Lincoln, here was Scorsese in the back alleys of New York, where life felt like it had such little value, where the world building was magnificent, the costumes were superb. It had such a life to it that I wouldn't have minded if Gangs of New York was 4 or 5 hours long, if you could just remain in that world for a little longer. I love the massive set. It would be the last time Scorsese would have a production like this, as now he'd favour CGI backgrounds over massive sets. Although, as Killers of the Flower Moon shows, if he is given the money, it does look like he prefers to do things for real. The movie powers through its flaws because of the sheer ferocity of its high points, one of which is just the world itself. There's scenes in the movie that don't need to exist, story-wise, but they're some of my favourites, and it feels like Scorsese just showing off, just having fun being in this world. Like that part with the camera going through the tavern as a casual voyeur, watching the dog and rat fight. There's a really good tracking shot of the immigrant's journey, coming off the boat, signing up for the war, saying goodbye to the family, boarding the ship, and the coffins coming back. It might sell itself as a sprawling, historic, Oscar caliber epic of a film, but let's be honest, Gangs of New York is more of a big budget, wacky, scrambled Looney Tunes movie with cartoonish and wildly over the top characters. But that's kind of why I love it. All the top hats and accents and wildly different gangs, sweeping epics are not really Scorsese's thing, and ultimately, it's quite a simple revenge story. The movie has a weird vibe. It's like it's really serious and really corny at the same time. It epitomizes a vibe that's often present in Scorsese's films, where it's very serious in the moment, but also farcical and funny upon rewatches. Kind of like The Sopranos. Scorsese's film before this, Bringing Out the Dead, was very similar in terms of its vibe. It's like when Bill throws the blade at Monk. In the moment, it's horrifying. The Irishman scrambling on the floor, helpless as the butcher closes in. But on rewatches, the movie has a comedic play-like feel to it, right down to Bill almost breaking the fourth wall. Sure, he's obviously talking to characters we can assume are in the barbershop, but he's practically looking right down the lens when he says,
"That, my friends, is the minority vote."
There's a silliness to it. It's full of tropes, the vibe is bombastic, it's glorious, elevated trash, like The Warriors with a paint of historical accuracy, or a 3-hour musical where everyone refused to sing. Early 2000 effects like changing frame rates, speeding up footage, blurring, color grading on the flashbacks. It's over the top and stylized, and it's very much part of the appeal of the film, but at the same time, it's a detriment. It's like the ending shot of New York as it goes through the ages, accompanied by the decaying graves of the priest and the butcher. It's clearly supposed to be a poignant and thought-provoking ending on the level of Barry Lyndon's epilogue, which ends with the line, "Good or bad, rich or poor, they are all equal now." One of my favourite ends to any film. It's hard to contemplate such themes of existentialism when you've got the Hands That Built America blasting at full volume through your speakers. I didn't find myself hit by the weight of the ending as I should have been, more hit by the alarming choice of music. Cameron Diaz wasn't great. I didn't think she derailed the film as much as many do, but certainly you can see others excelling in that role. But I would say that Leonardo DiCaprio was equally mediocre. I've got my problems with DiCaprio in Scorsese movies, and I've talked about this a lot in a different video, so I won't take up too much time here, but he never quite owned the role. You can see a lot of actors of his generation doing a job here, and whilst the wandering and phony sounding accent can perhaps be brushed off by saying the character was Irish but grew up in a multicultural New York and thus would have a mismatch of accents, there's a boy becoming a man element of the character that DiCaprio doesn't quite stick. He doesn't have that sense of imposingness, that leadership, that charisma that was required of the character towards the latter stages of the movie. Gangs is elevated and quite frankly centered around its villain, Bill the Butcher, and Daniel Day-Lewis's ferocious performance. It's quite literally centered around him, with Bill sharing a scene with every major and supporting character. It's an interesting way to frame the film, with Bill's shadow looming over the entire 5 points. Lewis was a force of nature in the film, and many of us will be familiar with the stories of his method acting, from refusing pneumonia medication because it didn't exist during the time period, and actually having his eye covered with a material that he taught himself to tap a blade against without blinking. Although the whole method thing is kind of eye-raising when you consider he would blast Eminem music before a shoot to pump himself up. I don't know. De Niro was at one point supposed to play him before he became too old to do so, and you can kind of see a lot of De Niro in D-Day's performance, like here.
Why don't you hang it up there and see?
When he isn't in the film, the quality of the movie is instantly lowered. I mean, when DiCaprio and Diaz are dancing, it's like watching a completely different film. They talk after too, full of stargazing, pseudo-intellectual deep dialogue which is scattered throughout the film and comes off as cringe and Hollywoody. In fact, that entire middle segment, where Amsterdam meets Cameron Diaz's character and gets to know her and her story, causes the entire film to slow down and become a bit boring. Sure, there are narrative arcs being served here. I think DiCaprio's talk with Diaz at night discussing her cutting her baby out was supposed to redirect DiCaprio to his mission. Perhaps he was mellowing in his quest and realized that all paths lead to the butcher. Even this girl he's found has been marked by him, and thus it's brought it all back to him, and the immediate next scene is of him training to kill Bill. But really, the movie could have been altered so that Cameron Diaz's character is entirely removed. People complain about her performance, but I think a far more glaring issue is that the character is superficial and serves little purpose other than a generic romantic subplot which detracts from the main story and seems to be there to get women to watch the film. I found myself understanding Bill more on a rewatch. He tells Amsterdam a spectacle of fear is what keeps him alive, and that's of course why he tortures Amsterdam in public, making a show of it, instead of killing him immediately. As Amsterdam says, when you kill a king, you don't stab him in the dark, you kill him where the entire court can watch him die. Bill also left Amsterdam alive to live in shame, much as how Priest Valen did the same to him. He admires Valen because he saw him as a worthy opponent, someone who made him a better version of himself, and it's part of DiCaprio's development that he begins to understand he must face the butcher head on in public instead of trying to knife him in the dark while he's distracted. The film shares a few similarities with The Departed, funnily enough, which Scorsese would release about 5 years later. In both films, DiCaprio must infiltrate a gang and gets taken under the wing by its leader. Bill looks at Amsterdam as a son, even directly saying, "I never had a son," and fatherhood is a major theme of The Departed too.
Is that what this is about? All that murdering and fucking and no sons.
Both movies are centered around the bad guy and both have a love triangle. There's a scene transition in the film I really love, where a guy who's with the natives is caught praying in a dead rabbit's church, and he goes irate when he sees a black man in the church. He complains to the priest, and the priest bangs him on the head with something, and that thunk is merged with the thumping soundtrack of the next scene. The camera whips as the guy gets banged, and it hilariously cuts to him with a band-aid on his head, and the next shot gives us more information that he's part of a pack that's about to attack the church. Such a smooth transition, no fat, no need to see him running out of the church and going to the butcher. It just goes from one scene to the next so effortlessly. I do wonder whether it would have been more effective if the movie didn't show Johnny telling the butcher that Amsterdam was Priest Valen's son. There would have been more ambiguity in the air as to whether Bill knew or not, whether he suspected. Like when he's sitting there as Amsterdam wakes up, Amsterdam's assassination attempt would have perhaps been more suspenseful. As it is, the wind is knocked out of it because we know the butcher knows something is up. Johnny could have then confessed to Amsterdam while he's strung up, with us never knowing fully when exactly he told Bill. It would add ambiguity to Amsterdam stabbing him also. Was it a mercy kill or retribution for betraying him? Was it a blood sacrifice in an atypical Scorsese Catholic guilt moment? Or was it Amsterdam having to harden himself to take on the butcher? Where Gangs of New York kind of falls apart is towards the end. The whole last segment isn't great. In the last hour or so, the movie goes batshit. 1 minute we're following the draft riots, next minute black people are being killed in the streets, then we're getting a rematch between the dead rabbits and the natives. It's all just complete chaos. It's like watching 3 films at the same time. All these different plot elements that the movie wants to cover, the drafts and riots and such, don't really synchronize well with the main story. Spare thought for me when I first watched it as a 12 or 13-year-old. I had no idea what was going on. For sure, the movie starts strong and then slowly falls apart at the seams. You've got that great prologue, the introduction to the 5 points, but then when we get stuck in with Cameron Diaz, there's an entire middle section you forget even exists the second time you watch the film. And by the time we get to the riot, it feels like it's all over the place with a hodgepodge of different scenes put together, and it goes at such a frantic pace too, after moving at such an easygoing pace. It's like they forgot they only had an hour to tell the rest of the story, and it barely scrambles over the finishing line. I'm no expert, so I can't comment too much, but it does feel like the history has been whitewashed in order to fit the Amsterdam storyline into the bigger draft riot storyline. From what I hear, much of the riots were due to fear that freed slaves would take jobs, and it was the Irish doing a lot of the rioting, pillaging and lynching. But in our story, the Irish are the good guys. There's a black guy with the dead rabbits who ends up getting killed, and you think to yourself, okay, so which group actually killed him? Wouldn't he have been with the dead rabbits in their duel? He was literally carrying Monk's casket, and is then off on his own at one point and gets taken out. It's all a bit confusing. It also feels like we were robbed of a big climax with the DiCaprio Daniel Day-Lewis thing coming to very little. Though I suppose that's part of the point, that these larger-than-life characters were so blinded by their hatred of each other and their own little world, that they failed to see the bigger picture moving around them, that they were no longer the big fish and there were bigger forces at play. They were now just a pixel in the picture. So this has been quite the lengthy review, and I think I'll end it there. What do you think of Gangs of New York? Let me know in the comments section below. Subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.